I wasn't invited to my daughter's wedding. She said, "It's a small ceremony, Mom. Very intimate." And that word, intimate, landed like a door quietly closing, the kind that doesn't slam but still locks you out all the same. At first, I thought I had misheard her. Maybe she meant intimate as in quiet, modest, a gathering of close family. But then I saw the list. The guest list posted by mistake on her cousin's Facebook page. Names of neighbors, co-workers, even people I barely knew existed. But not mine. My own. And I wasn't invited. I read the words on the screen over and over until they blurred into something shapeless, until even my name began to look like a stranger's. I closed the computer slowly, like I was shutting the lid on a coffin, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light. The house smelled faintly of lemon soap and something metallic from the pipes. Outside, the ocean murmured against the rocks, the way it always does when the tide pulls in. Slow, inevitable, unbothered. I live by the sea now. 78 years old, 2 hours north of where Margaret grew up, in a weather-beaten cottage with blue shutters that don't quite close. It's quiet here. Too quiet sometimes. But that kind of quiet that teaches you to listen inward. When my husband died 8 years ago, people said I'd never manage alone. They were wrong. I learned how to patch a roof, change a fuse, unclog a sink. I learned how to keep the freezer stocked with just enough for one person, how to fix the squeak in the back door that used to make him curse. What I never learned was how to outgrow the sound of my daughter's voice when she says my name like it's a burden she has to lift. Mother. Not mom, not mama, just mother. Clipped, polite, a word with distance built in. The last time she visited, she stayed 2 nights and spoke mostly in logistics, train times, insurance, taxes. She used to laugh with me. She used to fall asleep with her head in my lap. Somewhere along the way, I became a task to manage, not a person to love. I suppose that happens to women my age. We turn invisible, not because we fade, but because people stop looking. You start noticing it at the grocery store when the cashier speaks to you like you're a little hard of hearing, or when young couples look through you on the street. And the saddest thing is that it starts at home, with your own children, the ones who once clung to you so tightly you couldn't even close the bathroom door without tiny fists knocking. So yes, when I saw that wedding post, something inside me went very still. Not angry at first, just hollow, as if my bones had been scooped out and filled with echo. I poured myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, stood by the window, and watched the light change on the water. There are moments in life when humiliation feels heavier than grief, because grief admits love, but humiliation admits hierarchy. You have to accept that someone has placed you lower than them, and you're expected to stay there quietly. I thought of calling her, of pretending I'd heard a rumor, but the thought of her voice tightening, the sigh, the careful tone of patience she reserves for me. Oh, Mom, please don't start, stopped me. I've learned the language of omission. When people want to hurt you without looking cruel, they leave you out. Later that night, I found the official wedding announcement online. Margaret Harper, daughter of the late Dr. William Harper. I stared at that single word, late, and realized they'd buried me too. No mention of me. My husband was dead, and apparently, so was I. There was a time when my name meant home, when Margaret would shout it from the garden, covered in mud, clutching daisies she'd stolen from the neighbor's yard. Now it was erased as neatly as chalk from a board. It's strange. The kind of death you can experience while still breathing. the kind where people walk around you like you're a monument to something they'd rather forget. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I whispered that she was starting a new life, that perhaps she didn't want to upset me with memories of her father, that maybe it was an oversight. But truth doesn't live in maybe. Truth lives in the ache between words, in the tone people use when they've already decided who you are. I made her wedding dress once, for her first marriage, decades ago. Pale silk, my fingers trembling as I stitched the hem. I remember the way she looked in it. Young, nervous, radiant. When she left that husband, I was the one who packed her boxes, found her an apartment, paid her rent for 3 months while she found her feet. Now she was marrying again in the same chapel where her father and I had renewed our vows on our 30th anniversary, and I wasn't even worth a seat in the back row. I didn't cry that night. The tears had learned to wait. I sat instead with a notebook and a pen, old habits of a woman who survived by writing what she couldn't say. I wrote her name, then mine, side by side, and stared until they stopped looking related. It's frightening how easily love can be edited out of a life. Not broken, just edited, like a photograph cropped to fit a smaller frame. I thought of calling the priest at St. Mary's, the same one who baptized her, to ask if he'd seen her lately, but it felt pathetic, like begging for scraps of belonging. So I did nothing. The next morning, I walked to the shoreline and let the cold air slap my cheeks awake. The tide was high, the gulls noisy, the sand still wet from the night rain. The sea has a way of making all human insults feel small, but it also reminds you of permanence. You can scream into it, whisper to it, curse it. It keeps coming back. I thought about how Margaret used to love collecting shells, how she once told me the sea sounded like 1,000 hearts whispering at once. Maybe that's what I've become now. Just one voice among 1,000, faint and repetitive, echoing through her past. People always talk about forgiveness like it's a simple act of will, as if you can just unclench the fist around your own heart and let the pain fall out. But I think forgiveness requires recognition, and she hadn't even acknowledged the wound. You can't forgive someone who doesn't think they've done anything wrong, so instead, I made a small promise to myself that morning by the water. I wouldn't chase her. I wouldn't beg. But I also wouldn't disappear. There had to be some way, some quiet, dignified way, to be present without permission. When I came home, I looked at the framed photograph of her on my mantel. She was 10, missing a front tooth, laughing with a popsicle in her hand, the summer light turning her hair into gold. That girl wouldn't have shut a door on her mother. That girl would have run across the room just to show me her new shoes. Somewhere between then and now, she had learned from the world that mothers are temporary, useful only until they become inconvenient. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger and whispered, "I'm still here." That was when I began to think about the letter. Not revenge, not drama, just truth. The kind that doesn't shout, but hums low and steady like the tide. I didn't know what I would write yet, only that silence had become unbearable. Maybe she wouldn't read it. Maybe no one would. But at least my words would exist somewhere, even if my body wasn't welcome. That thought was enough to calm me for the first time in days. I made myself tea again, the same cup gone cold before, and drank it to the bottom. The bitterness didn't fade, but at least it was mine. I sat at the table until the light went gray, until the gulls quieted and the sea fell into its evening rhythm, and I told myself, softly, almost as a prayer, they may erase your name, but not your voice. The letter that confirmed it all arrived. 2 days later, tucked between grocery flyers and a bill I had already paid, a pale cream envelope with my daughter's handwriting on the front. Deliberate, graceful, distant. I held it over the sink as if expecting it to sting, and in a way, it did. The paper smelled faintly of perfume, the same lavender scent she used as a teenager. I traced, "Dear Mother, I hope you're well. The wedding will be a small, private ceremony. Travel might be difficult for you, and we don't want you to feel pressured. We'll send photos." No signature, just her name printed at the bottom, Margaret, as if she were signing an office memo. No warmth, no exclamation marks, not even a pretense of sentiment. I read it 3 times, trying to find something human between the sentences. Some trace of the girl who once wrote me birthday cards, covered in glitter glue. But there was nothing. Just politeness. The deadliest weapon of modern cruelty. I set the letter down on the counter, the words already burning themselves into my skin, and for a long while I couldn't move. The refrigerator hummed, the kettle clicked, the wind rattled against the window, and still I stood there, reading that one line again. We don't want you to feel pressured. The tone of mercy, the illusion of care, the kind of gentleness that makes the exclusion sound reasonable. That was what stung most. Not the rejection itself, but the choreography of kindness around it, as if they were protecting me from my own irrelevance. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where I had sat after finding out online, and laid the letter beside my cup. The ink shimmered slightly where the light hit it, like it was alive. My hands were steady, but my heart felt like a loose hinge, swinging between disbelief and something much colder. Recognition. The next morning, I walked into town to collect a parcel from the post office. The woman behind the counter, a widow like me, asked casually whether I was traveling soon. "You used to visit your daughter often, didn't you?" she said, smiling kindly. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and said, "Not anymore." The lie was small but heavy. I could feel it pressing down on my chest as I walked home through the narrow streets, past the bakery where I used to buy Margaret her favorite almond croissants, past the florist who still greets me as Mrs. Harper, not knowing how misplaced that name feels now. Every corner of this town held a ghost of our shared life. The dress shop where I bought her graduation gown, the church where she sang in the choir, the old movie theater where we once escaped a summer storm and watched a terrible romantic comedy just to stay dry. I passed them all like someone walking through a museum of their own extinction. When I reached home, the sea was restless, tossing white foam against the rocks as if mocking me for believing that blood guarantees belonging. I sat on the back steps and opened the envelope again. The words didn't change. They never do. What changes is the reader, the angle of the pain, the way it shifts from disbelief to humiliation, to a strange, grim clarity. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't forgetfulness or oversight. It was a decision. Someone had decided that I would not be part of that moment, that my presence would unbalance the symmetry of her new life. They wanted a picture-perfect wedding, polished, curated, free from reminders of age, of loss, of anything that didn't fit the magazine version of love. And I, with my gray hair and steady hands and history of holding things together, didn't match their palette. That afternoon, I called the church. The secretary was polite but distracted, shuffling papers as she said, "Yes, the Harper wedding, next Saturday at 2. I asked, pretending to be a friend of the family, whether the ceremony was open to guests. "Private event," she said. "Invitation only." Her tone softened, maybe sensing something in my silence. "I'm sorry," she added, the kind of sorry people say when they don't know the story. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the phone. That was when the first real wave of anger came. Not the loud kind, but the deep, rational one that sits behind the eyes. I realized they hadn't just forgotten me. They had rewritten the narrative so that my absence looked considerate. They had made me the fragile one, the one too frail for travel, too emotional for ceremony, too much trouble to include. It's a clever trick, really, to remove someone's voice and then claim they never wanted to speak. I spent the next hours walking around the house like a stranger in a museum. Everything looked both familiar and irrelevant. The framed family photos on the mantel, the china set I'd kept for special occasions, the box of letters Margaret had written from college that I once couldn't bear to throw away. I opened the box and read a few at random. "Mom, I got an A in literature." "Mom, can you send some money for groceries?" "Mom, I miss you." The handwriting grew steadier with age, the sentences more formal, and eventually they stopped altogether. I closed the box and pushed it back into the drawer. It felt like placing flowers on a grave that no one else remembers exists. At sunset, the mail truck stopped at the corner again, and for a moment I thought I saw Margaret's face reflected in the window. Absurd, of course, just the reflection of my own. But it startled me, because for a second I realized how long I'd been waiting for her to appear, how some part of me still believed she would drive up the hill and say it was all a mistake. That hope, that ridiculous, fragile hope, is what finally broke me. Not the letter, not the omission, but the quiet endurance of still wanting to be loved by someone who had already turned away. I went inside, poured a glass of wine I didn't enjoy, and stared at the framed photo of her father. "You'd have known what to say," I whispered, though I doubted that. He had always been the peacekeeper, the soft negotiator. But sometimes peace is just another word for postponing the truth. I don't remember deciding to write the priest. It happened like instinct, the way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before you feel the burn. I sat down with stationery I hadn't used in years, the good kind with thick edges and faint lines, and began with one simple sentence. If I cannot attend my daughter's wedding, I ask only that she be married in the presence of truth. My handwriting trembled at first, the loops uneven, but as the ink flowed, so did the words. I didn't write out of vengeance. I wrote because silence had become unbearable, because I needed someone to know that my absence wasn't consent. I wrote about love. Not the sentimental kind, but the kind that keeps cooking when no one says thank you, that stands in the rain at school gates, that listens, forgives, and listens again until the years pile up. I wrote about what it costs to raise someone who believes they owe you nothing, about how easy it is to erase a mother when her usefulness fades. And at the end, I wrote a line that came from somewhere deeper than anger. A daughter does not bury her mother by omission. To erase the living is a greater sin than to mourn the dead. When I finished, the house was dark except for the lamp on the table. I sealed the letter carefully, addressed it to the priest of St. Mary's Church, to be opened on the day of Margaret Harper's wedding, and placed it beside the sink. I didn't trust myself to mail it yet. I needed to sleep on the decision, to test whether it was courage or just pain dressed as courage. I washed the cup, wiped the counter, straightened the tablecloth, all the small motions that make loneliness bearable. Then I went to bed and lay awake, listening to the sea. It moved with the same rhythm as breathing, in and out, relentless and calm. Somewhere between those sounds, I realized that what hurt most wasn't being left out, but being rewritten as fragile, irrelevant, invisible. They wanted me to vanish quietly, to confirm their version of me by complying. And I would not. The next morning, I woke before dawn, dressed, and walked down to the postbox at the corner. The air smelled of salt and cold metal. I slid the letter through the slot and listened as it landed inside with a dull, hollow sound. The sound of something irreversible. For a moment I stood there, hand still on the cold metal, watching the first light stretch across the horizon. Then I whispered, "So be it." It wasn't a curse, not even a prayer, just a statement. Something had ended, but something else had begun. The slow, deliberate act of reclaiming the truth of my own story. The morning after I sent the letter, I woke with a strange kind of steadiness, the sort that follows a storm when the sky is scrubbed raw and everything smells faintly of salt and aftermath. For the first time in weeks, I didn't reach for my phone to check if she had called. I didn't hover over the computer hoping for a message. I knew there wouldn't be one. That knowledge had settled somewhere deep inside me, heavy but calm, like a stone at the bottom of a clear pond. I made coffee, the cheap kind that tastes like burnt wood, and drank it standing by the window as the gulls carved white arcs above the sea. The horizon looked endless that morning, unbothered by human dramas. It's humbling, really, how the world keeps moving, no matter who forgets you. I remember thinking, almost detached, that it might be time to go somewhere. Not to escape, but to breathe different air. The house had begun to feel like an echo chamber, full of memories that stared back at me too closely. Every corner carried a version of myself I no longer wanted to meet. The mother waiting by the phone, the wife tending to a husband's silences, the woman who lived for others' convenience. I wanted space wide enough to hold only my own thoughts. I began packing without a plan, folding clothes with mechanical care, stacking them into a small brown suitcase that had survived decades of airports and disappointments. I left the heavy coats, the porcelain cups, the old photographs. I took only what could fit into one bag and one handbag. Identification, wallet, notebook, a small framed photo of my husband from our first year together, the only one where he looks shy instead of tired. I wrote a note for the neighbor who sometimes checked on me. Gone for a while? Don't worry. That was enough. No destination, no return date, just gone. I stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking on the mantel, the faint moan of the sea through the open window, and I realized I wasn't sad. What I felt was clarity, the pure, unsentimental awareness that no one was expecting me anywhere, and that for the first time, that might be freedom. At the bus station, the air smelled of diesel and old coffee. People moved with purpose, students with backpacks, couples arguing in low voices, an old man reading the timetable with his glasses slipping down his nose. I bought a ticket to Portland because it was the first name I recognized that wasn't here. When the driver called for boarding, I felt a flicker of hesitation, a ghost of guilt. What if Margaret did notice I was gone? What if she needed me and couldn't reach me? Then I remembered her letter, the careful distance of it, and the guilt evaporated like steam. You can't be missed by people who have already rewritten you out of the frame. The bus pulled away slowly, the sea retreating into a thin silver line behind the window. I didn't look back. The road unspooled like ribbon through forests and small towns, each mile peeling something off me. I watched the landscape change from soft coastal fog to the hard clarity of inland hills. The rhythm of motion did something to my thoughts, smoothing them out, turning sharp memories into passing scenery. I thought of her childhood in flashes, the way she used to line up her stuffed animals before bed, the nights she'd crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, the time she wrote me a card that said, "You are my safest place." I didn't know when that stopped being true. Maybe safety became suffocation. Maybe love, when it lasts too long, turns into something that demands more space than others are willing to give. I'll never know. Somewhere between towns, the bus stopped for gas and sandwiches. I stretched my legs, bought a lukewarm coffee, and stared at my reflection in the vending machine glass. 78, hair thin but still stubbornly dark in streaks, wrinkles deep but not unkind. I looked like a woman who had survived something. I realized, with a small start of pride, that I had. When we reached Portland, evening had already folded the city in gray. The station was crowded, but not chaotic. Travelers, drifters, people like me who carried more silence than luggage. I found a cheap motel across the street, the kind where the walls smell faintly of bleach and the clerk doesn't ask questions. My room was on the second floor, a narrow space with a single bed, a desk, and a small window overlooking the parking lot. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled sounds of televisions and plumbing. It wasn't home, but it was mine. I turned on the lamp and opened my notebook, thinking I might write to Margaret again, but the words didn't come. There's no point talking to someone who's already rehearsed her answers. Instead, I wrote a single line across the page. Freedom is not joy. It is the absence of permission. Then I closed the book and lay down fully dressed. I slept deeply, dreamlessly. The next morning, sunlight leaked through the curtains like apology. I went for a walk. Portland smelled like wet concrete and pine needles. The city had changed since I'd last been there decades ago, but some streets still felt familiar. The bakery on the corner, the bookstore with creaky floors, the park where children shouted as if the world would listen forever. I walked without destination, following whatever street felt kind. Eventually, I found myself standing outside a small cafe with a chalkboard sign that read, "Help Wanted, Mornings." I laughed quietly. The universe does have a cruel sense of humor. I hadn't worked in years, not since before my husband's illness, but something in me stirred. Not desperation, more like curiosity. I pushed the door open. The smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around me. Behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes looked up and asked, "You looking for work?" I said yes before I could think. She handed me a form on a clipboard. My hands shook slightly as I filled in the blanks, writing my name slowly, as if testing its weight in a new world. She glanced at it, then shrugged. "Come tomorrow, 6 a.m. Trial shift." Just like that, I was employed again. That evening, back in the motel, I ironed the blouse I'd worn on my husband's funeral day. Simple navy cotton, clean lines, no memory attached except endurance. I didn't expect much from the job, maybe a few hours of distraction, but I realized I wanted to belong to something again, even if it was just the rhythm of a coffee machine and the clatter of dishes. The next morning, I arrived early. The street was still asleep, Shop windows dark, air crisp with the promise of rain. The young woman, whose name turned out to be Heather, handed me an apron without introduction. "You wash, you pour, you keep moving," she said. I nodded. My body remembered faster than I expected. Years of caregiving had trained me for service. You watch, anticipate, adjust, and never complain. Customers came and went. Workers in reflective jackets, nurses, students, each leaving behind a trace of noise and warmth. By 9, I had found a rhythm. Heather didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. At the end of the shift, she wiped the counter, glanced at me, and said, "You did fine." I realized no one had said that to me in years. Fine was enough. Fine was human. Days began to fold into each other, steady and strangely gentle. After work, I walked through neighborhoods that smelled of laundry and rain. I found a small room for rent in an old house owned by a woman named Joyce. Sharp-tongued, gray-haired, and allergic to pity. She looked me up and down when I came to see the place and said, "You clean?" I said, "Yes." "You quiet?" "Yes, again." She nodded. "Then you can stay. Cash only." The room was small, but the window faced east, and in the mornings, the light poured in like forgiveness. I paid the first week in advance and moved in that evening. Joyce didn't ask questions. She simply pointed to the kitchen and said, "We share. Label your food." That was her version of kindness, and I understood it perfectly. One night, after another long shift, I came home and found Joyce sitting on the porch, smoking. She offered me a cigarette. I hadn't smoked in 30 years, but I took one anyway. We sat in silence, 2 women carved by different disappointments, listening to the rain hitting the tin roof. After a while, she said, "You running from someone?" I exhaled slowly. "No," I said. "I'm running toward something." She chuckled, the sound low and knowing. "Good answer." We didn't talk after that, but something like companionship settled between us. Quiet, unspoken, sufficient. At the end of my first week at the cafe, Heather handed me an envelope with $74 in cash. My first paycheck in decades. I held it in my palm for a long time before slipping it into my wallet. It wasn't about the money. It was about proof. Proof that I could still earn something by my own hands, that I wasn't just existing in the margins of someone else's generosity. That weekend, I walked into a thrift store and bought a wool coat, navy blue with deep pockets. It wasn't new, but it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for me. When I put it on, I felt taller, not younger, just more solid. The woman at the counter said, "You look sharp." I smiled and replied, "I feel sharp." That night, I walked home through the drizzle, the coat warm around me, and for the first time since the wedding letter arrived, I didn't think of Margaret. I thought of the sea, of the bus, of the smell of coffee, of Joyce's dry humor, and realized that my life, the one I thought had ended, had quietly begun again, without asking permission. The next morning, I wrote a short note in my notebook before heading to work. When they left you behind, they freed you without knowing. When you stepped away, you began to exist again. I underlined it twice. It was the first time in years that the words I wrote didn't come from pain, but from recognition. The world had moved on, and so had I, not in anger, not in triumph, but in motion. The simplest, most human form of survival. By the time autumn rolled in, the air in Portland had begun to carry that faint, metallic chill that reminds you of endings, but also of the kind of beginnings that don't announce themselves with fanfare. The days grew shorter, and with them came a rhythm so steady that I almost stopped noticing how far I had drifted from the life I used to call my own. Every morning, I walked the 10 minutes to the cafe through streets still wet with dawn, the city waking up in slow fragments. Delivery trucks, joggers, the hiss of buses turning corners. I would unlock the side door, hang my coat on the same hook, tie my apron, and step into the gentle hum of the espresso machine like it was a kind of prayer. I had learned the regulars' names, their habits, their tempers. There was a nurse who always ordered black coffee and left exact change, a man who read the paper cover to cover before work, a pair of students who whispered fiercely about poems they didn't understand yet. They were all strangers, but in their repetition they became the quiet architecture of my new life. I wasn't anyone's mother here, or anyone's burden. I was simply the woman who poured the coffee right up to the rim without spilling, who remembered your order, who smiled but didn't pry. Heather, my boss, had softened too. She was still brisk but less guarded, and sometimes she'd push a scone toward me after the rush and say, "Eat, you'll fall over." We never talked about our private lives, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that kindness didn't need explanation. 1/3 I started boiling water, cleaning counters, keeping the customers talking until she could breathe again. When the morning was over, she sat across from me and said, "You're wasted here." I didn't ask what she meant, because I knew she didn't mean ambition. She meant something smaller, but truer, that I was still alive enough to matter. In the evenings, when my feet ached and the smell of coffee clung to my hair, I'd come home to Joyce. She had grown used to me, though she'd never admit it. Our coexistence had its own language. A raised eyebrow for, "How was work?" A sigh for, "It's been a long day." A shared plate of toast for, "I'm glad you're here." She was 70 herself, sharp in mind and blunt in mouth, the kind of woman who believed self-pity was a form of bad manners. "People always think tragedy makes you special," she said once as we shelled peas together. "It doesn't. It just makes you quieter." I liked that. It was the first philosophy I'd heard in years that didn't sound like a prescription for pretending. I began taking small walks after dinner, down to the park where children played until dusk and older couples fed pigeons by the benches. Sometimes I'd sit there, just watching. There's a strange sweetness in anonymity. No one knows your story, so no one can distort it. I started carrying a small notebook in my coat pocket, writing down scraps of thought between bus stops and shifts. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted proof that I could still create something that wasn't service or regret. One evening, while scribbling at the park bench, I realized I hadn't thought about Margaret in nearly 3 days. The realization didn't come with guilt. It came with relief, like a window opening in a room you didn't realize had gone stale. A week later, Heather called me into the back office, a cluttered space that smelled of old paper and burnt toast. "You want more hours?" she asked, glancing at the schedule. I hesitated, thinking of my knees, of the mornings that came too soon. But the truth was, the work had become my anchor. "Yes," I said, and she nodded like she already knew I would. When I stepped back into the front room, I caught my reflection in the window, apron dusted with flour, hair pulled back, eyes alert. I didn't look like someone waiting anymore. I looked like someone in motion. That Saturday, I took my first day off in weeks. The rain had finally paused, leaving the sky rinsed and pale. Joyce was in the garden trimming dead branches. She called out, "If you're going out, bring back something sweet." I'm tired of my own cooking. I told her I would and headed downtown. I wandered through the market stalls, breathing in the smell of spices and rain-soaked fruit, and for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I stopped at a stall selling used books and picked up a small, cloth-bound collection of letters by women long gone. Their handwriting looped and leaned across the pages like vines, each one trying to explain some impossible thing: grief, love, forgiveness, silence. I bought it without thinking. On the walk back, I read one line that made me stop. Freedom begins when the story no longer requires an audience. That night, I lay in bed reading those letters until my eyes blurred. The words didn't comfort me exactly, but they reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That I had lived an entire life before motherhood, that my existence had contours and colors beyond the title of someone's mother. I thought of Margaret again, but differently now. Instead of seeing her as the source of pain, I saw her as part of a long pattern of women who inherit silence like an heirloom. Maybe she didn't know how to see me because she never learned how to see herself. That thought didn't excuse her, but it softened something inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that love can coexist with distance, that forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. A few days later, while closing the cafe, Heather handed me a small envelope. "Someone dropped this off for you," she said. My heart stumbled. I opened it with clumsy fingers, half expecting Margaret's handwriting. But it wasn't. It was from Kieran, my grandson. The letter was short, written in the hurried scrawl of youth. "Grandma, I found your old address in Dad's drawer. They said you left suddenly. Are you okay? Please write back. I miss you." The simplicity of it nearly undid me. I sat there long after closing time, the neon sign flickering against the window, tracing each word like a map. The child who once built birdhouses in my backyard was now old enough to worry about me. I could feel tears pressing behind my eyes, but they didn't fall. I folded the letter and tucked it into my apron pocket. It was proof that I hadn't vanished entirely, that somewhere, someone still remembered who I was without being told. When I told Joyce about it later, she shrugged. Kids who care are rare. Keep him close, even from a distance. That night, I took out my notebook and began a new page. "Dear Kieran," I wrote, and then stopped. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him everything: the letter, the wedding, the silence. But it felt like dragging him into a war he didn't start. So I wrote instead, "I'm safe. I'm happy. Tell your mother she doesn't need to worry." I never mailed it. Sometimes peace is knowing when not to speak. Life settled into its new form again, but something had shifted. The letter from Kieran had stirred a quiet defiance in me, a refusal to keep existing as if I were invisible. I began dressing with more care, wearing lipstick again, walking a little straighter. Heather noticed. "You look different," she said one morning as we set out pastries. "Better." I laughed. I think the clerk handed it to me without question. I wanted a place where letters could find me, even if people didn't know where I lived. It was a small gesture, almost absurd, but it felt like claiming a small piece of permanence. Later, walking back under the streetlights, I thought about how far I'd come from that kitchen by the sea, the one filled with silence and the ache of being unwanted. I had left behind more than a house. I had left behind the version of myself that waited for permission to exist. That night, as rain began again, I stood by my window watching it streak down the glass in trembling lines. The city glowed faintly beneath the clouds, the sound of traffic, a soft hum in the distance. I thought of Margaret, not as my betrayer, not as my child, but simply as another woman trying to assemble her life from the pieces she'd been given. I hoped, in some unreachable corner of her heart, she would feel the absence of me not as loss, but as a presence she couldn't define. And maybe one day she would understand that what I had done wasn't abandonment. It was survival. Before bed, I wrote one last line in my notebook. I thought I came here to hide, but maybe I came here to return to myself. I closed the book and turned off the lamp. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, like the pause before a new breath. It began with a phone call I didn't expect and didn't recognize at first. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray, indecisive day when the sky can't decide whether to rain or to hold back. I had just finished washing the dishes after lunch and was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the drops slide down the glass in thin, trembling trails. The phone rang twice, paused, then again, as if the caller was unsure whether they wanted to reach me at all. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, there was a long silence, just breath and static, before a voice said my name, soft, uncertain, and unbearably familiar. Mom? The sound of that word, spoken again after so many months, landed like a blade that cut both ways, pain and longing in the same instant. For a moment I couldn't answer. I just sat there, gripping the phone, my throat closing around all the words that had waited for this moment. She spoke again, quieter now. It's Margaret. As if there were any possibility I wouldn't know. I said her name back to her, slowly, to hear how it still felt in my mouth. Margaret. There was another silence, longer this time, and I could almost hear her rehearsing sentences on the other end, trying to choose the least dangerous one. Finally, she said, I found your letter. My heart stopped. The letter. The one I had sent to the priest months ago. The one I'd almost convinced myself would stay buried in that church archive or burned after the ceremony. I didn't ask how she got it. I knew it didn't matter. The world has strange ways of returning what we send out, no matter how far we think we've hidden it. Her voice was calm, but not steady. It was read out loud. Everyone heard it. I closed my eyes. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the air thickening with old shame and a flicker of vindication I didn't want to feel. She kept talking. You embarrassed me, Mom. You humiliated me in front of everyone. How could you do that? The question wasn't a question. It was a verdict. I opened my mouth to speak, but found no words that could reach her through that wall of hurt. I wanted to say it wasn't meant to humiliate her, that it was meant to exist where I could not, that I had written it not to wound but to be present in some invisible way. But explanations are fragile things. They collapse under the weight of anger. So I said the only truth I could find. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because you erased me. There was another silence. I could hear her breathing, fast, uneven. Then she said, almost a whisper, You don't understand. And I thought, of course, that is the sentence that ends all conversations between mothers and daughters. You don't understand. I wanted to tell her that understanding isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's endurance. But before I could speak, she said, I'm coming to see you. My heart jumped. You know where I am? I asked. She didn't answer. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the tea long gone cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in my small room felt too thick, too alive with anticipation and fear. I kept replaying her voice in my head, that mix of accusation and something else. Grief, maybe, or confusion. I didn't know what she wanted from me. An apology? A confrontation? A reconciliation? The thought of seeing her again filled me with both hunger and dread. It's strange how you can long for someone's presence and fear it at the same time, like wanting to touch fire just to prove it still burns. Around 3 a.m, I got up, opened the window, and let the cold air slap my face. Somewhere down the street, a cat yowled, and the city, half asleep, answered with silence. I whispered into the dark, "Let me be strong," though I wasn't sure whether I was asking for strength to forgive or to defend myself. She arrived 2 days later, unannounced, as always. I was at the cafe, wiping down the counter, when Heather tapped my shoulder and said, "Someone's here for you." I turned, and there she was, my daughter, standing in the doorway with her coat still on, her hair perfectly arranged, her eyes scanning, the room like a stranger stepping into an unfamiliar country. For a second, no one moved. I wiped my hands on the apron, suddenly aware of the flour dust on my sleeves, the smell of coffee in my hair. She looked so polished, so composed, and I must have looked like everything she had tried to escape. But when our eyes met, I saw the crack in her poise, the tremor at the corner of her mouth, the smallness in her posture that betrayed exhaustion. I walked toward her slowly. She said nothing, just stared, her jaw tight. I gestured to a table in the corner, away from the noise. She followed. We sat facing each other, the air thick with all the words we hadn't said in years. She was the first to speak. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "Leaving you out, it wasn't about hate. I just wanted peace." I looked at her, trying to find the girl I once knew in the woman across from me. "Peace," I said softly, "isn't the absence of people who make you uncomfortable. It's the presence of honesty." She flinched a little, her hand tightening around her cup. "You made everything so heavy," she said. "Every conversation was about the past, about Dad, about what I wasn't doing right. I just wanted a clean start." I nodded slowly. "And to make it clean, you erased me." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You think that letter was brave? It was cruel." Everyone looked at me like I was some kind of monster. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch her hand, but something in her expression stopped me. "Maybe they finally saw something true," I said. "Not a monster, a wound." She shook her head, angry now. "You always make it about pain, Mom. Everything has to have a lesson, a moral. Sometimes people just want to live." Her voice cracked on that last word, and suddenly she looked young again, fragile, like the child who used to hide behind my skirt when she was afraid. I felt the old instinct rise in me, to comfort, to soften, to take the blame just to make the world easier for her. But I stopped myself. That was the old pattern. This time I needed to stay still. We sat there in silence until Heather approached with 2 refills, pretending not to notice the tension. When she left, Margaret sighed. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "I came because I can't stop hearing your words in my head. To erase the living is a greater sin than to mourn the dead. People keep repeating it. They say it was beautiful." Her voice trembled on that last word, and something in me softened despite myself. "It wasn't meant to be beautiful," I said. "It was meant to be true." For a long while, we said nothing. She stirred her coffee, eyes fixed on the small whirlpool she was creating. Finally, she said, "I can't undo what's done, but I don't want us to stay like this." It sounded rehearsed, yet sincere in a way that made my throat ache. "Then don't," I said. "Change it." She looked up sharply. "It's not that simple." I smiled, a little sadly. "It never is." She opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again, as if realizing there was no argument that could make the past tidy. When she left, she didn't hug me. She stood, adjusted her coat, and said, "I'll call you." I nodded, though we both knew she wouldn't, not yet. Still, something had shifted. As I watched her walk away through the rain-streaked window, I felt no anger, only an immense, weary tenderness, the kind that comes after a long illness when you stop fighting and start breathing again. I turned back to my work, my hands steady, my chest strangely light. That night, back in my room, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Joyce must have brought it in from the mailbox. Inside was a photograph. Margaret on her wedding day, standing beside her new husband, her eyes looking directly at the camera. Behind them, faint but unmistakable, was the stained glass of St. Mary's Church. On the back, a single sentence. "I heard you." No signature, no apology, just that. I sat on the bed holding it, the paper trembling between my fingers. And for the first time in months, I cried without bitterness. They were not the tears of loss or humiliation, but of recognition, the kind of tears that water something growing in the ruins. The next day, I brought the photo to work and pinned it inside my locker, where no one would see it but me. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a beginning of something quieter. That evening, when I closed the cafe, Heather asked, "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Better than before." She smiled and said, "That's enough." Days passed, and the world kept moving. The leaves turned and fell. Joyce's health began to waver, and I found myself caring for her in small ways, making soup, washing dishes, leaving her notes that said, "Rest." One night she said to me, "You've got that look of someone who's come through fire." I laughed. Maybe I did. She looked at me for a long moment. "You didn't just come through it. You lit it yourself." Sometimes that's the only way to see in the dark. Later, as I lay in bed, those words stayed with me. I thought of the letter again, how I had written it in desperation, in grief, in the belief that I had no voice left. But maybe that letter was never meant for Margaret alone. Maybe it was meant for me, to remind myself that silence is not survival. I had spent so many years believing that endurance was a kind of virtue, that love meant swallowing your own truth to keep the peace. But peace built on erasure isn't peace at all. It's a slow burial. Winter came early that year, crisp and bright, the air filled with the smell of pine and frost. I found myself walking to the post office again, holding another envelope. This time, it wasn't for a priest or a daughter. It was for Kieran. I wrote, "Dear Kieran, thank you for remembering me. I'm well. I work at a cafe now, and I like the smell of bread in the mornings. Tell your mother she doesn't need to write yet. Just live kindly. That's all I ever wanted for her. Love, Grandma. When I slid it into the mailbox, I felt no tremor, no doubt, only peace. The kind that comes when you've told the truth without expecting an echo. That night, as snow began to fall outside, I sat by the window again, the city quiet under its white blanket. Somewhere, miles away, my daughter was probably doing the same, sitting in a warm house, maybe looking at the same sky, holding that photograph of us both in her memory, even if she wouldn't admit it. The world felt wide but connected, stitched together by invisible threads of love, pride, and pain. I closed my eyes and whispered into the silence, not as a plea, but as a benediction. May you never have to learn the cost of forgetting, and may I never again mistake silence for love. Then I turned off the light, let the darkness settle gently around me. And finally, after all those sleepless nights, slept as though I had been forgiven by the world itself. It was late winter when the final movement began, though I didn't recognize it as such at first. The days had started to stretch by a few extra minutes, thin ribbons of light unfurling earlier in the mornings and clinging stubbornly to the evenings. I had settled into a calm rhythm. Work, home, a cup of tea by the window, a few lines in my notebook. My world had grown smaller but steadier, like the quiet pulse of a heart that has accepted its own pace. Joyce had fallen ill around that time. Nothing dramatic, just the long, slow decline of someone who has seen too many seasons. I began spending my evenings in her room, reading aloud from the newspaper or the book of letters I'd bought months ago at the market. Sometimes she would listen, eyes half closed, murmuring her comments about the absurdity of politicians or the beauty of a phrase. Other times, she would drift into sleep mid-sentence, her hand still clutching the blanket, and I would sit there a while longer, listening to her breath. It was in those hours, surrounded by the dim light of her bedside lamp and the faint smell of menthol and old paper, that I began to understand that care, once stripped of obligation, becomes something holy. One night, after I had turned off the lamp and was heading to my room, I found an envelope on the kitchen table. My name was written in a hand that trembled just slightly, but I knew it instantly. Margaret's handwriting. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, afraid to touch it, as if it might vanish if I reached too quickly. When I finally opened it, I was surprised by the brevity. Only a few lines. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. I don't know how to fix what's broken, but I think we should try. Can I come see you again? No apology, no explanations, but something quieter, more fragile. A request, not a declaration. I sat down, the letter trembling in my hands, and read it again and again until the ink began to blur under my tears. The next morning, I wrote back. I told her yes, of course, and I gave her the address. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to prepare or script what I would say. Whatever needed to be spoken would find its shape when it was ready. I didn't tell Joyce about it, though she must have guessed. She had that way of reading faces the way others read weather. A few days later, she said, "You've got that look again." I asked what look she meant, and she said, "The one people get when something is about to shift." I smiled and said, "Maybe." Margaret arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sky was low and gray, the air thick with that particular dampness that smells like melting snow. I had taken the day off from the cafe, cleaned the kitchen twice, set out an extra cup by habit, though I wasn't sure she'd stay for tea. When the knock came, I didn't rush. I opened the door slowly. She stood there, holding her purse like a shield, her hair pulled back, her eyes cautious but not cold. "Hi, Mom," she said, and the simplicity of it undid me more than any speech could have. I stepped aside, and she came in. The silence that followed was strange, not hostile, just dense with everything unspoken. She looked around the small kitchen, the modest furniture, the window that faced the alley. "This is nice," she said. "Simple." I laughed softly. That's one way to put it. We sat at the table, and for a while, neither of us spoke. I poured her tea. She didn't. When he started reading, I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't move. Everyone was staring at me. It felt like my whole life was being held up for inspection. She looked up, her eyes wet. "Do you know what it's like to feel that exposed?" I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said. "For years." That stopped her. She looked, but when I heard it out loud, when I heard your words, I realized they weren't angry. They were grieving. I swallowed hard. I was grieving the living. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. After the wedding, people kept coming up to me, saying it was brave of me to let that be read, as if I had allowed it. But I didn't allow anything. It just happened. And maybe it was supposed to. She looked at me then, with something close to humility. "I wanted a perfect day, Mom. I wanted to start over without all the ghosts. But it turns out you can't start anything new by pretending nothing came before it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I reached across the table, this time not stopping myself. My hand rested on hers, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. We sat like that for a long moment. The kitchen felt smaller, but in a good way, like the space between us was closing inch by inch. She whispered, "I'm sorry." The words were small, almost embarrassed, but they landed with the weight of a lifetime. I didn't say it was okay. I didn't rush to absolve her. I just said, "Thank you." Because forgiveness, I had learned, isn't a ceremony. It's the quiet acceptance that the wound will never fully close, but you can stop pressing on it. After that, she told me about her new life, the house they'd bought, the garden she hadn't planted yet, her husband's children from his first marriage. She said she wasn't sure where she fit, and I could hear the loneliness beneath her composure. I listened without advice, without correction. When she paused, I said, "You fit wherever you stop apologizing for being yourself." She smiled faintly. "You always talk like you're writing a poem." "Maybe I am," I said. "It's the only way I know to tell the truth." When she left that evening, she hugged me. Not the formal embrace of duty, but a real one, arms tight, breath shared. She whispered against my shoulder, "I don't know how to fix everything." I said, "Then don't. Just love honestly." She nodded, her face pressed against my coat. "I'll try." When she stepped out into the cold, I watched her walk away, her figure small against the gray street. I didn't feel the need to call after her. I didn't need promises. What we had exchanged was enough. A few days later, a letter arrived from Kieran. He thanked me for writing, said his mother had shown him the cafe online, and that he was glad I looked happy. He ended it with, "I think Mom's trying. You were right. She hears you." I read it aloud to Joyce, who was awake but weak, her voice barely a whisper. "Told you," she said. "Fire clears the forest, but then something new grows." She smiled faintly and drifted back to sleep. That night, I walked to the park. The air was crisp, the ground soft from thawing snow. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement like broken stars. I sat on a bench, the same one where I used to write in my notebook, and took out a piece of paper. I began a new letter. Not to Margaret, not to Kieran, not even to myself. To no one in particular. To the air, the sea, the world. I used to think survival meant silence, I wrote. But survival is speaking even when no one listens. It's writing your name in the margins when they've erased it from the page. When I finished, I didn't fold it neatly or keep it as I had before. I tore it into small pieces and let the wind take them one by one, watching them scatter into the darkness. There was no anger left in me. Only the lightness that comes after truth has finally been spoken aloud and no longer needs to be defended. For the first time in many years, I felt not invisible, not wounded, not forgotten, but whole. When I returned home, Joyce had passed in her sleep. I sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand, which was still warm. There were no words, only the kind of silence that feels sacred. I realized then that life doesn't offer resolutions, only continuations. Margaret's voice, Joyce's laugh, the cafe's hum, the sea's memory, all of it wove together into something larger than any single sorrow. I placed the photograph of Margaret from her wedding on Joyce's bedside table, beside a small vase of dried lavender. "Look at her," I whispered. We made it through. The next morning, as the sun rose over the rooftops, the first light touched the edge of my window. I stood there, coffee in hand, the city stretching awake below. I thought of my daughter somewhere out there, maybe looking at the same sunrise, and I smiled. The story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was still being written. The morning after Joyce's funeral, I woke to the sound of gulls circling above the rooftops, their cries sharp against the stillness of early spring. The house felt hollow without her, the air thinner somehow, as if her silence had taken up more space than her voice ever did. I made coffee, poured it into her favorite chipped mug, and placed it on the table across from me out of habit. The steam rose for a moment, twisting and fading like a spirit reluctant to leave. Outside, the city had begun to stretch itself awake. The distant hiss of buses, the rumble of delivery trucks, the faint scent of bread from the bakery down the street. Life, indifferent and persistent, kept going. That was its mercy and its cruelty all at once. I sat there for a long while, tracing the rim of my cup, feeling the weight of everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. In the weeks that followed, I found myself moving more slowly, as if time itself had thickened. Work at the cafe continued, but the days felt quieter, less urgent. Heather noticed, of course. She had a way of seeing things without asking. One evening, as we closed up, she said, "You thinking of leaving?" I looked at her, surprised. "No," I said. "Not leaving, just rearranging." She nodded. "Sometimes that's harder." We didn't speak again, but her words lingered. Rearranging. It was exactly what I was doing, internally, invisibly. I wasn't running from grief anymore. I was rearranging it into something that could coexist with peace. I began spending my afternoons by the river after work, sitting on the same bench I had once written on, watching the water shift colors under the changing light. I started carrying Joyce's old scarf with me, the one that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, as if she were still leaning over my shoulder. Some days I brought my notebook. Others I just watched. The city seemed softer now, less like a stranger and more like a companion who knew how to keep its distance. The people walking by were no longer faceless. I noticed their gestures, their exhaustion, the small kindnesses they offered one another. It reminded me that invisibility is not always punishment. It can also be sanctuary. A letter arrived from Margaret a month later. It was longer than the last one, written in careful, deliberate lines. She told me about her garden, how she had planted roses that were finally beginning to bloom. She wrote about Kieran's new job, her husband's quiet patience, the small domestic rhythms that made up her days. And near the end, she wrote, "I think about that day at your kitchen table a lot. I keep wondering what you meant when you said love has to be honest. I'm trying to learn what that looks like. I don't know if I'm any good at it yet, but I'm trying." There was no apology this time, but I didn't need one. Trying was enough. I wrote back, telling her about Joyce, about the cafe, about the calm that had settled in me like a tide finally finding its shore. I ended with a line that came to me as I wrote it. "We don't have to start over, darling. We just have to keep going without pretending the cracks aren't there." After mailing the letter, I walked through the market, the same one where I had once bought the book of women's letters. The stall was still there, though run by a different vendor now, a young man with ink-stained hands. I looked through the stacks and found an old journal, its pages blank, its leather cover soft with age. I bought it, though I didn't need another notebook. It felt right to have something waiting, a space for whatever came next. That night, I opened it and wrote the first line. This is not an ending, only a place to rest. As the days warmed, I found a quiet contentment in the smallness of things. The hum of the espresso machine, the murmur of strangers, the feeling of sunlight through the cafe window. People began to recognize me, not as a customer or a ghost, but as part of the scenery. A man once told me, "You make this place feel steady." I thanked him, though I wanted to tell him that steadiness had been hard-won, that it had taken a lifetime of breaking and rebuilding to earn that kind of calm. One evening, I received a photo from Margaret by email. It showed her garden in full bloom, the roses open and heavy with light. In the background stood a small wooden bench. She'd written, "I made space for you here. Maybe one day you'll sit on it with me." I stared at the image until my eyes blurred. It wasn't a reconciliation in the dramatic sense, no grand gesture, no tearful reunion, but it was something deeper, an invitation, fragile but real, the kind that asks nothing, promises nothing, but opens a door all the same. I printed the picture and pinned it beside Joyce's photograph on my dresser. They looked at each other across the small wooden frame, the friend who had held me through the quiet resurrection of my spirit, and the daughter who had unknowingly broken and remade me. Between them, I saw the outline of my own life, the ache, the survival, the strange grace of continuation. That night, I walked down to the river one last time. The air was mild, the water smooth as glass. The moon hung low and full, its reflection rippling across the surface like a soft exhale. I thought of all the women who carry their lives quietly, who love without witnesses, who are forgotten in the stories they themselves built. I thought of the generations of silence stitched into our blood, and how each of us must unpick it, thread by thread, until the shape of our voices emerges again. I whispered into the dark, not to anyone in particular, but to the lineage of invisible women behind me. We are not lost. We are simply returned to ourselves. When I finally stood, I felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because it had found its place. I walked home slowly, the night air cool against my face, the city breathing around me. Inside, I turned off the lights and sat by the window. The mug I had placed for Joyce earlier was still there, cold now, but somehow comforting in its stillness. I looked at it and smiled. "We did well," I said quietly. Outside, dawn began to gather at the edge of the sky. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote the last line I would ever need to write. "If they close the door on your love, find another way in. If they silence you, speak anyway. The world belongs to the women who refuse to disappear." Then I closed the book, placed it beside the photograph of my daughter's garden, and watched as the first light filled the room, soft and forgiving, carrying with it the quiet promise that even the forgotten can begin again.